Well, set up. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Sebastian. How are you?
Good. Honestly, I've been looking forward to this conversation so much, and it feels very, very timely. Quite a few of my favorite podcasts have decided to do shows on SRM, geoengineering lately, outrage and optimism,
hmm
reversing climate change,
hmm
and so yeah, it feels like the topic is heating up, is bubbling up, and you're the perfect person to ask all the hard questions I have. So very
I
excited.
will. I'm honored. I would love to talk about that with you. It does seem like there is like a cultural zeitgeisty moment, and I have thoughts on why that is, but I'll let you
And I'm
lead.
sure we're going to get there. So what I really want to get out of today is I want to cover quite a lot of ground in 45 minutes. And I want to get a couple of basics out because I think there will be a few people on the LinkedIn Live who might just need to be picked up where they are, but we're going to
hmm
keep it quite short.
hmm
And then I'd love to spend time on some of the really hard questions and thorny questions around global
Cool.
cooling. For the people who are listening in, yeah, feel free to put things in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it and bring questions into this conversation. But maybe, Paul, I mean, you pivoted into the space from CDR, which is why this is very relatable to
hmm
many, I'm sure, who are watching. So maybe tell us first, how did that happen? And then, can you explain global cooling, like really briefly, the
Yeah.
basics, what it is? Yeah.
hmm Well, for those who don't know, my history was as the co-founder and first CEO of Nori, which we ran for 7 years, but shut down a little over a year ago. And it was after that I started noticing a growing unease in myself around the lack of scale with carbon removal. And I had been thinking when I first entered the space in 2015, oh yeah, sure, by 2025 we'll be removing 1 billion tons a year, and we'll just be growing from there. And like, look where we are. I just
We
saw your post.
celebrated a megaton
Yes,
today. That's another
yes,
very timely update.
right. So lots of orders of magnitude away from where we need to be. And so throughout the course of this year, I've been throwing myself into trying to understand, like, okay, what's the implication of that? If we're not currently meeting our scaling goals on carbon removal, and we're certainly not, as a society, meeting them in terms of emissions reduction and decarbonization, then what does that mean? And as I was investigating that, I came across this paper that came out by James Hansen and his team earlier this year. I don't remember the exact title, but it was like, is the UN aware of the acceleration in global warming or something like that? And I, it was a look at, like, we have really accelerated back. I mean, if your mental model for climate change is grounded in something in the late 2010s, when we were at maybe zero point 0.9 degrees, maybe approaching 1 degree, like, we've breached 1.5 already. And so we've had significantly accelerated warming. A lot of the potential reason for that is because of sulfur aerosol unmasking by changing shipping fuels. But regardless, it is hotter now than we expected it to be. We've breached 1.5 a lot sooner than we thought we would. And the main two tools that we've been using to try to respond to climate change are not actually doing what we needed them to do in terms of emissions reduction and carbon removal. So we're in a dangerous spot. And I started learning more and reading up on tipping points, and then ultimately things like solar geoengineering, which is stuff that I always thought of as, like, okay, that's like a late 21st century sort of
Yeah.
problem. We don't have to worry about that yet today. It feels kind of sci-fi.
I
Um,
mean, Ministry of the Future is probably how
yeah.
most people, frankly, have been exposed to this, including myself first, right?
hmm
And I don't
Right.
remember, it was definitely a few years ago. Yeah, it felt like sci-fi, right? It was like, oh, wow, okay, yeah, maybe one day this could, but now it's like, okay, will this happen in the next 5 years? So yeah,
Right.
it's approached crazy fast.
Yeah. And so that's exactly right. And so I started trying to read every book I could find on this to try to understand, like, what's the current thinking about this, like, acknowledging that I'm coming at this from a lot of expertise and experience in carbon removal, but the solar geoengineering field is much older than carbon removal, or even it's much older than the concept of managing carbon emissions itself. So it's a storied field. I mean, so the first proposal for doing sunlight reflection was the first like official proposal was in 1965 in a report given to President Lyndon Johnson. So,
That's wild.
yeah, it was, and it was presented in a manner of like, hey, just so you know, like we're aware of warming, and if it becomes a problem, we'll just reflect a little sunlight. It'll be okay, no big deal. And then they just kind of moved along, and it wasn't until the late 1980s, going back to James Hansen, when he gave his testimony to the U.S. Senate, which is coincidentally, I just learned this. It was a week after I was born. And he gave this testimony to the Senate and convinced them that, like, okay, we actually need to think about addressing this problem. And they had just come off the success of passing the Montreal Protocol, and the notion of dealing with these CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons that were causing problems with ozone destruction. So they had this like paradigm or framework for thinking about emissions management. And CFCs is an entirely different problem than CO2. It's much easier. There are fewer like point sources of that, so we could actually manage that with regulation in a fairly straightforward way. Obviously, carbon emissions are much more complicated and much more difficult. And there's like political lobbying barriers from oil and gas and all of that. So when the UNFCCC was established in, I think, 1992, that was the mode that people were thinking about. They were thinking about it in terms of we can take the same approach. We've been successful with managing these CFC emissions. We can take a similar approach to managing CO2 emissions. And so that's how we got the paradigm of mitigation. And mitigation, I think, is such a like silly word to use for this, but it's so entrenched now. The goal was to reduce emissions so as to mitigate the effects of global warming. And that's why we call emissions reduction mitigation.
And I know that you've
And
made a strong case that we should change that narrative
yes, yes.
towards
Well,
stabilizing global temperatures instead.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's where I think we are today. Briefly, I'll just add to at the time in the 90s, the notion of doing adaptation, of saying, okay, we're going to do things with infrastructure to adapt to a warming climate. That was anathema because
Yeah.
people thought of that as like giving up on the real problem. Eventually, it just became kind of widely accepted, although there are still holdouts on that. And then the carbon removal faced the same challenge in the 2010s, where it was viewed as a moral hazard. So many times I had debates with people around
We all do.
2015, 2016. Yeah, it's like less so now, right? Like it's more accepted. The
It's still
IPCC,
pretty strong, especially on the environmental left. Like within the climate bubble, it's definitely, and we're going to get to that, I'm sure, for SRM.
yeah.
But yeah,
So now in the 2020s, now we have accelerated warming, we have tipping point risks coming up, and mitigation and carbon removal are not happening fast enough. So that's why we're starting to think about this. And I proposed, as you mentioned, I think a better paradigm for responding to the current situation that we're in, which is a situation where we risk destabilization of lots of important systems like food systems and insurance and other things that are critical underpinnings to all of human society. I think it would be more helpful if we were making decisions under a framework of trying to produce better stabilization for the future.
but like take what really blows my mind. I mean, if I look at Johan Rockström, right, leading climate scientist, his work on tipping points, his TED talk on tipping points is probably the main exposure people have to this concept of
Hmm.
tipping points, not of so
That's
so
right.
SRM. And just before the COP, he released a very strong kind of statement on what needs to happen. And he made a case for hundreds of gigatons of carbon removal as the only way to kind of get us back to 1.5 to minimize overshoot. And alongside obviously phasing out the fossil fuels and other stuff, he didn't mention SRM or global cooling. And so if this is something that I found quite interesting in thinking about this conversation. Like, it's such a taboo. And you've got the leading climate scientist working on tipping points, probably the person who knows better than anyone else what an AMOC collapse means, how likely it is, and when it could happen. He's not talking about this.
Right.
So why is that?
Yeah. Well, we'll go back to what I was trying to learn in the first half of this year about this stuff, and there, Johan, along with Tim Lenton and others, hosted the Global Tipping Points Conference at the University of Exeter in July, and so I went to that,
Ah,
and
nice.
I, it was small. It was about 400 people, very academic. Not at all like a corporate, like a carbon removal conference. I mean, it was mostly paper presentations and seminars, and the first 2 days were focused much on these tipping point risks. So it was like paper presentations about AMOC collapse or Amazon dieback, or ice sheet collapse, and that sort of thing. And then on day 3, I was in one of the early coffee breaks. I was just meeting people, and I started talking to this scientist I hadn't met, and I explained, oh, I'm coming from the carbon removal world, and I'm really sort of curious about what we're going to do about these risks. And I'm surprised that I haven't heard anyone use the G word yet. And he said, oh, well, carbon removal and geoengineering, those are just cover for oil and gas. So you're not going to find
Yeah,
anyone here who's in support of that. And my jaw dropped. I mean, okay,
that's really
I can
interesting.
accept the notion of geoengineering moral hazard. Like we haven't really had that
Even
debate
carbon
yet. So,
removal, right?
but
Yeah,
carbon removal too? Yeah.
in that
So
context, yeah.
that radicalized me. And I came away from that conference thinking, wow, there is an enormous perception gap on this. People need to know more about this. I need to know more so that I can talk about this in an educated way. But there's a significant problem if we're going to need this in the near term future. And that's it, like the people who know best, as you say, are the ones who are opposing it. Like that's crazy to me. So, I, I've listened to interviews with Johan about this, and he'll say that it's just too risky. It's like meddling too much in complex systems, and it would be better if we just focused on trying to build up what they call positive social tipping points, which I agree that we need those. That's how it will eventually decarbonize. But I
But why
agree,
is why
it's
I still
insufficient.
like it's I'm still trying. Like, let's go one level deeper on this taboo, on this stigmatization. And what's the main reason? Is it the moral hazard argument, you think?
Oh, it depends. I mean, it depends on who you ask because the thing about maybe we should briefly just describe like there are a few different proposals on the table for how you could intentionally lower the temperature of the planet, and the idea here is you would want to reflect about 0.5% to 1% of incoming sunlight so that you can reduce the temperature. We could probably at most do about 1 degree. And you would do that. There's this a famous graph that was drawn in the early 2010s called the napkin diagram, and because it was scribbled on a napkin, but it's basically a time chart showing as we are decarbonizing and bringing emissions down and then removing legacy past emissions, so temperature on the y-axis and time on the x, we would reflect a little sunlight. So we do like peak shaving. So if the temperature would normally go all the way up to like 2.5 or 3, and then over the next couple hundred years come down, we could bring it down so that we are not dealing with the consequences of that time while we are continuing to decarbonize and remove carbon.
But there's the first huge assumption, right?
Hmm.
That I mean,
That while we are doing it, yes,
yeah, like I mean,
yes.
if you take away the urgency
Hmm.
and it costs a lot of money and industry is struggling,
Hmm.
would we keep decarbonizing?
I think it's like the moral hazard risk is real. It's not artificial and it's not made up. I I come down more on the side of like it's real, but we have to face it head on anyway. Like I just don't see how we have a choice in the matter. Which is exactly how I felt and talked about carbon removal in the early days of that industry as well. It's like, well, it doesn't matter. We have to figure out how to build an industry capable of removing billions of tons of CO2, and we have to get started on that as soon as possible. And I would view this in the same way. We have to figure out how to do both things at the same time, and that means that really, actually, the problem here is not so much like technological scale up or industrial challenges like we face with carbon removal. The problem is much more about politics and governance and how do you make decisions about this kind of thing.
And I want to get there in a second, but if we stick with the moral hazard, like when again, my reference point is carbon removal, right? And in carbon removal, there are kind of really two main ways I think I answer that concern. The first one is we can clearly differentiate with policy tools like separate targets, right? And we could do the same for solar radiation management, I imagine, but it's not happening in carbon removal. Like over and over again, like take the EU 2040 target. We don't have split targets. It's all put in the
Yes.
same bucket again. So that is
Oh,
an
yeah.
argument that works in theory, but in practice, it's not actually working. Then
That's
the
fair.
other argument that is working though is just cost. It's just really
Hmm.
expensive. So you can always say it makes no sense to use carbon removal when decarbonization is infinitely cheaper. And there is that nice kind of equilibrium that you can create with those two tools. But that's also not that doesn't apply to social to global cooling because global cooling is so cheap. And so yeah, what's your main argument that you can actually use against moral
Yeah.
hazard in your case?
I, there are a couple arguments that people use. One is that, well, decarbonization and especially energy transition is more and more being driven by market economics. And so we would expect that to continue. The other argument that I find more compelling, I don't know if others do though, is that sunlight reflection, in order to cool the planet down, does nothing to deal with the problem of ocean acidification. And acidification is a huge risk to global food systems and our global economic order. So that doesn't do anything to solve that problem. The only solution for that is carbon removal.
Biodiversity. I mean, that's the other thing with this with global
Sure.
cooling, right? Like
Yeah.
it doesn't address biodiversity loss, ocean acidification. There's a
Right.
lot
Yeah.
of
All of
things
these
that it
other.
just doesn't
Yeah.
address.
That's
And
right.
and and so your argument is those things would be so bad if we don't decarbonize that would be sufficient incentive to keep decarbonizing.
I don't know if that's if that's the argument that like would convince policymakers, for instance. Like I don't know if that's going to be the argument that convinces a policymaker to say like, yeah, we do need to mandate a phase out of fossil fuels, but it's at least a valid scientific reason.
Yeah. But I mean I'm super worried about this, right? Like I
Yeah,
totally understand that if we have a tool that can quite cheaply do the job, and maybe
but
if we if we
the other thing too is
yeah,
it can't go on forever. Because as you continue emitting and you're reflecting sunlight, like I said, you can only do about 1 degree. But let's say that we would have continued marching up towards something like 4 degrees, and then eventually we're reflecting sunlight, but we're only able to get it down to 3 degrees. That's still untenable.
fair.
So,
Okay, that's actually that that is an argument.
yeah, you cannot just keep pumping more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere without consequence. This is not a get out of jail free card. And the other thing that I hear a lot of scientists in this space say that I think is important to get across is reflecting sunlight to bring the temperature back down by half a degree or a degree or something like that is not the same thing as going back to the conditions that we had when the temperature was a degree lower. It's that was one climate. The climate system that we have today,
It's already
with
different.
it's already different. This would be a third new novel form of climate, and it's not the same thing. And because as you pointed out, biodiversity loss, and then we've got ocean acidification and other environmental harms that are not being fixed with this. It's not a fix;
And
it's a temporary band-aid.
and I keep getting us moving here because there's so many topics. So we talked about moral hazard, and one that is a direct continuation of what you just said is just the regional variations. Like this is something that really blows my mind, right? Like how this how A, we probably don't understand well enough the regional variation of global cooling. B, even if understood, it could actually be used as a weapon of war potentially.
Yes.
But yeah, what's your take on the whole regional variation of global cooling?
I'm less concerned about this than I think others are. I think it has become sort of a large bogeyman. From the modeling, which there has been lots and lots and lots of modeling on this for multiple decades now, and from the modeling, we're reasonably confident that you could do this in a way that more or less produces benefits for everyone without any real significant harms to anyone anywhere.
That's a bold statement.
Yes,
That is a very
but I
to anyone anywhere. That is a very bold statement.
well by that I mean we already have climatic variability, right? Like if you're living in an equatorial region that is dealing with climate change as it is today, it's too hot and you're suffering. And if you're dealing in a northern area, then you're not feeling the harm as bad. So like we already live in a situation where many people are getting the unfair end of the stick on that. The real question is, does deploying and also, we should be specific about this too, because there are different ways that you could do either local, regional, or global cooling. And the one of the things that I think needs to be said often, or people need to be reminded of, is oftentimes when we are talking about global cooling, we are talking about stratospheric aerosol injection. And that's a specific method. It's not the only method, and but that's the idea that we're building off of what we know from volcanic explosions, and then having a fleet of planes injecting sulfur aerosols in the upper stratosphere, maybe 10 million tons a year, and they're lingering for a couple of years. Um, the question is, like, what happens? I mean, the real risk around these regional stuff is the attribution problem. So if you start doing this and then there is a drought somewhere, or unexpected rainfall and causes flooding or something like that, and there are damages from this, like, how do you assign liability to that? And
That
like,
was my next topic. Yeah.
yeah, there's no good answer. Nobody has a good answer for that. That is an unsolved problem. And this just add it to the long list of things that need to be overcome on the governance side of things. Because again, that is the by far much more difficult aspect of this. Like if we wanted to, if we let's say we had some like idealized form of international policy making decision framework for this, and we got enough consensus and we decided that we wanted to do stratospheric aerosol injection, we could probably start doing it within 5 to 10 years. And so like that's pretty close.
What's this is actually a question. Why 5 to 10 years? Why not next year? Like, what's actually holding us back, just from an
So
implementation perspective, leaving
So,
everything else aside?
specialized planes, basically. So, there are different proposals for this, and the thing is that there are these two main layers in the atmosphere. You've got the stratosphere and then the troposphere. We live in the troposphere. That's where weather is, and you get a lot of volatility there. And there's a barrier called the tropopause between the troposphere and the stratosphere. The stratosphere exists at different altitudes depending on where on Earth you are, north or south or equatorial. So at the equator, I don't remember the metric numbers, but at the equator it's like 70,000 feet. But at the poles it's something more like 20,000 feet. The
Wow.
tropopause.
Yeah.
Uh, so you could, and if you wanted to deliver this with planes, like a typical like jet airliner would not be able to go high enough to reach the stratosphere and deploy these sulfur aerosols in at the equatorial regions, but they could at the poles. And so there are proposals for, like, if we were to get started with this, if we were to slowly start dialing it up, we would start at the poles. And then because of the rotation of the Earth, you just deploy it, and then the aerosols will rotate around, and you'll get homogeneous movement. So you get full distribution
But you
around
need special
those.
planes that we don't have
We
today
don't have those.
anywhere in the
We don't
world.
have those today. Yeah, I mean, so the historical analog would be like the American U-2 spy plane. Like that's capable of going high enough, but
Yeah, but
that's
I
like
can't
a
carry 10 million tons.
precisely, yes. Yeah. So you would need to develop new plane technology, and that typically takes 5 to 10 years to go
Sorry,
through
but
that
this
process.
sounds like I wasn't aware of this. This sounds almost an impossible hurdle because if I think who can build these planes? Airbus,
Only a
Boeing,
few, only a
Embraer,
few
like
countries. Yes.
I mean, there's very few actually
It's
companies that
it's
can build big planes, and they have a
it's
backlog, a commercial backlog of thousands of planes for the next at least 5 years.
Yeah, but
So,
I would assume that this would come through defense contracting, and that's a totally different like commercial pipeline and that kind of thing. And then the other, I would actually say the more important factor is access to air bases. So that the experts that I talk to in the space are believe there are only a handful of countries that are capable of doing this. It's
which
like the
ones? Because that was my question. Like, who could actually do this? Not just some
U.S.,
rich, like,
China, Russia, perhaps the EU. I don't ever hear people mention NATO, but I kind of think of it as NATO.
so it's very limited, right?
Uh,
Because there's this idea that anyone, this one was one of my questions, a company,
yeah.
a philanthropist could do this, but the answer is probably not, right?
No, I like the sort of fictional depiction in Ministry for the Future where India does that and where India just like spins it up like that
Yeah,
year or something. Like that's
yeah.
not really that plausible. And then the Termination Shock book by Neil Stephenson, that's also like not that plausible. But you could see a combination, and many people worry about this, of like um a wealthy tech billionaire pairing up with either the U.S. government or maybe an affected country like Saudi Arabia or something like that, like and just kind of going rogue and doing it. Like that's not an impossible thing to envision, but the air bases is a barrier to overcome. But you could also see the other thing too is I made the claim earlier that from the modeling, we're reasonably confident that we could do this in a way that produces only net positives without really any significant net negatives for people in different regions. That's only if you do the idealized deployment scenario. You could have situations where someone does this in a way where you're not doing it in the idealized scenario, and then you do get large scale regional impacts because it's only being deployed on like one side of the planet, for instance. That would be a bad thing. That's potentially the worst case scenario.
But what you're telling me, which is somehow reassuring to me at least, is that even if you had like, I don't know, Elon Musk like teaming up with Trump and saying we're going to do this tomorrow, it would actually take them quite a long time, and the world, I guess, would have some years to actually react and try to do something about it.
Plausibly, if you were to start doing it at the polls, you could probably start doing that in a much nearer time frame because you're going to normal altitudes for normal jet airliners.
Okay, next topic, which I think is very controversial, is the role of the private sector, right? Especially
Yeah,
off the
yeah, yeah,
back
yeah.
of the Stardust
Hmm.
60, 75 million investment Israeli company. And I've heard, and it's very compelling to me, that the private sector has a lot of benefits, but it really shouldn't be leading these efforts
Yeah,
because their incentives is to do as much as possible of this as soon as possible, no matter what, because that
yeah.
drives shareholder value in many ways.
Hmm.
So, how do you see the ideal role of the private sector in this?
Hmm. Um, yeah, it's a complicated topic. I think that, like we were just saying, when we're talking about like who's going to be building these planes, like it's going to be like Boeing and Airbus doing that. So obviously that's the private sector, but that's how the defense industry has always worked. And
Planes,
so
I get. Like, let's all the
yeah,
supporting infrastructure, one
yes.
thing, but not like a company that says, I'm selling you basically global cooling as a
Right.
service.
Yeah. So Stardust is a really interesting case. I've spoken with some of their investors. I haven't spoken with their team yet, but others in the field have. I the issue I have with their approach is I think it's totally inappropriate to have intellectual property on the particle that's being deployed. So what they've proposed is that they have developed a new particle that they say
Yeah.
is inert and doesn't cause any issues, and
Biosafe, inert, all of that
yeah,
stuff.
they haven't presented any evidence for this yet,
That's highly
and
problematic.
and pursuing IP on that is absurd. There's a really good organization called the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. So they're probably the main org that is focused on community engagement and how do we build good governance for this in the future. And they had a really good article come out after the Stardust announcement, and they make the important point that like deploying stratospheric aerosols is non-excludable, meaning you do it and it impacts everyone. You can't like opt out because it will just distribute throughout the atmosphere. And that means that like it's yeah, I just think it's totally inappropriate. I also think that the governance structure of that, of having a private corporation with a however many, call it 5-person board of directors, being responsible for making decisions about this, is
Crazy.
also like completely inappropriate for a solution of this order. However, all of this said, yeah, I don't like what Stardust is doing. I don't think it's appropriate. I think that there are other roles that private sector can play, and I think that if there was more, like if Stardust was a nonprofit, this would be an entirely different proposition, right? But that said, I do understand the mindset of like their co-founders thinking like, hey, this is obviously an important thing. Somebody needs to be building this, and okay, there are different proposals for the thing that you could inject in the atmosphere or in the stratosphere, ranging from sulfur aerosols to like diamond dust to other things. Like maybe we could develop a thing that would be better than any of those options. Like I get that mindset of wanting to build a better solution for people, but I just like from an ethical perspective, I don't think that they should be doing that. I do think that there are important roles for private sector to play when it comes to like monitoring or even building the deployment technology, but it's uh
Yeah, they can't be in the driver's seat.
yes, exactly. That
That
this
for me is just
absolutely
mind
cannot
blowing.
be.
And I mean, you
Yeah.
spoke to investors, right? Like interestingly, lower carbon capital, kind of a an investor that has invested a lot in carbon removal, that's also invested in them. And yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to see where this is going to go, if more kind of stardusts are going to pop up. But yeah, a space to
Yeah.
watch.
I at the very least, I mean, the other main for-profit company that people talk about a lot is Make Sunsets,
Yeah,
and
even
they
more
are yeah.
challenging,
So
but less
that
serious, probably. Yeah,
yeah, that one's different because they're having like a negligible impact. It does not
exactly. Yeah.
matter how many balloons they're releasing, and in fact, in some way, like I sort of think the jury's out on whether or not that's a good thing.
It
Like,
was
does this
almost
make people?
activism. It wasn't like a
Yeah,
proper
yeah,
company.
yeah,
It
yeah,
almost
yeah,
felt like it was a bunch of
yeah,
activists who like
yeah.
call
Right.
themselves a company.
Yeah. So does this force us to have conversations that we need to have anyway?
Exactly.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And if so, that could be a good thing. That could be a positive contribution.
Um, so I did a poll on LinkedIn and around 200 people replied, and I asked basically if they would support global cooling today.
Hmm.
Um, and I was shocked that almost a third said yes.
Ah, okay.
That was very high. I saw that kind of averages. There's some surveys done in the US and UK, and they get kind of 10 to 15, which I already found very high. I guess because it's kind of a CDR bubble that's largely my following, we get higher numbers. But I was pretty shocked by that one third. I also gave the option no, maybe, or we need more information. And the question I have for you, I guess, is what's the point we need to reach? What's the indicator we need where you would say it becomes a complete no-brainer? Or maybe we've reached that already, but like what are you looking for?
I think that I think that we're probably already there.
That's what I thought you'd say.
However, we're certainly not ready. We're by already there, I mean that the conditions under which like geopolitically, we're not like look at the COP30, what just happened. Like we're not phasing off fossil fuels. Carbon removal is not happening fast enough. So I just wrote an article yesterday on my Substack about this where I think that there's sort of two dimensions of awareness that if you get to the final step in each of these, then it kind of does seem like a no-brainer. Like we're going to have to do this. But I just want to say like we're not ready, and there are a whole bunch of strategic questions that need to be answered and solved for before we would decide to do this. First and foremost is how do we decide to do this? Who gets to decide that? What's the structure of that? So like governance is like first and foremost the most important thing.
That will take years and years and years. So if that's the
Potentially. I mean,
gate,
we can come back to that. There's stuff happening there, I think. But these two dimensions of awareness, one is the timeline reality. Like, and this, I'm actually not surprised to hear that your audience, who are largely carbon removal people, are higher on this than maybe the general public. And I was making the same argument because there's the timeline reality of understanding is how much warming is happening and what are we doing about it in response. Like, as people in carbon removal, we're already thinking about this portfolio of responses of mitigation plus removal, and you can just look at the numbers play out. Like, you can see temperature's gone up and removal is barely eking along, and we don't know if we've even peaked on emissions yet. So I think that a lot of people in CDR can understand that. The other dimension of awareness is on what these interventions are, what the trade-offs are, what the risks are, and the barriers to actually doing them. And that's where a lot of people, I think, are just kind of beginning their journey on trying to get educated and understand on that. Once you put both of those together, then to me, it feels like, just in the same way that when I started thinking about carbon removal in 2015, it's like, yeah, obviously we have to do this. Like, there's like the warming is already locked in. We've already emitted too much. Like, we're going to have to remove large amounts of CO2. I just view this the same way. Like, we are on track for hitting 2 degrees in 2037. Like, 2037, that's barely 11 years away from now, and that's untenable. That's not a world that we want to live in. So I do think that I sort of look at it like, yes, there are all of these problems and challenges and scary things about this, but we have to overcome that. We have to find a way to solve these problems. And so yeah, I just want to be really clear. These problems exist and we're not ready to do this. And I'm not advocating we do this tomorrow, but the need to solve the problems is not going away.
but I think also the way that you described it, even if we decide we're taking this seriously tomorrow, it will take us 5 to 10 years anyway until we do this
Yeah.
properly, even if
Yeah.
we go full steam ahead. But what really concerns me still, we started there, but I'm coming back to it, is the stigma around this topic. Because how on earth do we go from where we are now, which is, as you say yourself, a niche of a
Yeah.
niche of a niche of a niche industry with a couple of
Yep.
thousand people, where scientists, leading scientists, are refusing. And actually, somebody in the chat shared an interview they did at the conference you attended with Johan Workström, where he spoke very negatively about
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
geoengineering,
Yeah.
which
I've seen that.
and the link is in the comments. And so, where do we how do we get from a point where at COP this is not a topic, nowhere close, where scientists are not touching this? Um, yeah, what do we do?
Yeah. Um, there are a few different efforts that are kind of going on right now for this. One is trying to get a handful of countries to start thinking about this from a risk framework, like a catastrophic risk framework. There was just was it last week or the week before, a national emergency briefing in the United Kingdom about this, with members of parliament attending, leaders of various industries attending, and they got a pretty good briefing on the various tipping point risks and like what's going on. I don't think that they really spent a whole lot of time on what do we do about it, but a lot of the uh I'm not sure of the right word. The sort of agreed upon approach, the unspoken agreed upon approach by people in the field is, let's focus on catastrophic risk education first, and then eventually start talking about, okay, what do we do about these risks? The other things that are going on is various Nordic countries are starting to pay a lot more attention to the risk of
I
AMOC
saw that.
collapse.
Yeah.
And so Iceland was the first country to say, like, acknowledge officially that this is a real risk. I was in October, a couple days after I saw you at Carbon Unbound, I went to Finland for a conference that a group called Operatio Arctis was hosting, where their intention is to educate Finnish and European policymakers on these risks and try to get more like research funding and stuff devoted to looking at this. And then there's an organization called the Overshoot Commission, which their approach is to try to get, like, if you can get 5 or 6 countries kind of on board with this risk framework and acknowledging that is too hot already, and we need to start looking at these various options. Like perhaps if you can get a block of countries together, they can start forcing more of a conversation at the fully international level. Those are the approaches that people are taking at the moment.
Because at the international level, one thing in the Outrage and Optimism podcast that became very clear is this should really sit within the UNFCCC. Like they are the body that
Yeah,
should be managing these discussions. And so I guess your approach is get a couple of countries and then get those countries to maybe push at that level.
as far as I understand it, I believe that that's what people are trying to do right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Wow. And do you think like how high do you see the risk of one of the big countries you mentioned just pushing ahead on this?
It doesn't seem like China is doing a whole lot on this right now, from what I'm told. So China, U.S., and Russia are kind of the three main ones that people discuss. The U.S., I mean, the U.S. is capable of moving quickly once it's like actually activated, but I mean, our political leadership situation is a total mess at the moment. So I don't necessarily expect that. And then Russia, like, I mean, Russia's totally ensconced in a failing war. So what resources do they have? So I don't personally think of it as like a huge risk that any one of these countries might just start trying to do this tomorrow.
Okay, interesting. Um, what do you think? Because one thing that I also find really interesting is carbon removal. That the challenge there is really capital, getting down the cost curve,
Hmm.
technology development, innovation. Um, whereas in this case, that's not the big challenge. Like the
No.
challenge is really governance, right? Governance,
Hmm.
governance, governance, and who gets to
Hmm.
do this.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, who, like you mentioned some already, but what are the levers we can pull that
Yeah.
already exist that kind of the biggest impact here
So
for
that's
governance?
been, yeah, that's been my area of focus. Like I was going around to different people in the field asking, hey, like I'm an entrepreneur. I don't, like I said, I don't think that the private sector should be leading on doing this. So what do you think an entrepreneur like me can help contribute to the field? And the thing that I've sort of landed on is um, there's, because of this taboo, there's no like permission space. If you're a policymaker and you are getting a briefing on this and you find this actionable and compelling, especially in the US, you can't come out and talk about it. Like geoengineering is mostly associated with chemtrails conspiracy theorists.
Yeah.
So, and most people have never heard of any of this. Most people in the public have never heard about any of this, and I think that they're at risk of hearing about it for the first time from the conspiracy theorists. So I've been interested more in how do you kind of use levers of culture to make this more at first permissible to even speak about, because we have to have these discussions, right? Like if you want good governance, you have to have deliberation and debate and discussion, and that needs to happen in open, transparent forums. And so if we're going to do that, we have to break past the censorship of this. So I've been wanting to like kind of help paint like what comes after that as well. So like we need more cultural markers of what it looks like to be successful in doing this. And Ministry for the Future is a great book, and I love Stan's writing and have read many of his other books. But it's also pretty dense and it's not that accessible to a lot of people. And there are only a handful of these different things. Like where are the movies, video games, art, anything else depicting like humanity being successful in solving this problem? And cooling methods are, I think, going to be an important component that play a role in getting us to the future where we've decarbonized and removed all the legacy emissions.
Yeah.
So that I think culture can play a bigger role than it currently is. But I mean, right now the biggest barrier is that the current field, as you alluded to, it's really small. It's like 1,000 people, maybe 2,000 at most, and it's mostly scientists and then people working in NGOs. So that means that it's all pretty much funded by philanthropic capital, and there's not a lot of it. There are a handful of different foundations that are providing funding in the space, and I think there's there's a huge funding gap, and that gap is driven by a perception gap. So, like high net worth donors, family offices, environmental foundations, they either know about this and they're scared of the taboo, or they don't know about it and they haven't even considered it as part of their portfolio of donations. So that's
Yeah.
probably the first thing that needs to change in order to like do all of this work.
Like I hear you and I agree this is a like a sensible approach. I just these people would get eaten alive. Like if I imagine like some sort of famous person creating some sort of educational material on this or video on this, I mean they would get annihilated in the current
Yes.
context, right? And it's chicken and
Yes.
egg problem because if we don't have that, we don't change the perception
Hmm.
that leads to that a green bashing.
Yep.
But yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, which is why I think that there's an important role that like bottom up cultural engagement can happen. Like we need to move the Overton window on this. We need to make this an acceptable topic of discussion, and so that's what I've been trying to explore, like in my writing. So talking about these dimensions
Which
of
I really appreciate.
awareness.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I like we have to have frameworks for how we can think about this and think about it in a way that doesn't immediately like gross us out because it like goes against prior held values or something.
perfect. And I think we have 45 minutes in. We can end on that note because I think it's exactly where we should end, right? Like hopefully the people who listened in today will have that discomfort and curiosity that you're calling for, that I certainly have. And yeah, we need to start having these conversations. So on that note, yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for coming on. Thank you everyone who attended and was great. Was everything I was hoping for.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me. That was fun to talk about.
Thank you.